the Japanese economy was built heavily around what the Japanese called zaibatsu, which was the large major corporations. There were 6 of them. One of them was Mitsubishi, and I'm sure you know they designed the Zero, and they designed a bunch of other aircraft, including the Betty bomber and so on and so forth. But the point I want to make about the zaibatsu is these corporations were huge. They had no equivalent in the Western economies. Mitsubishi in 1939 comprised nearly half the US economy in terms of industrial strength, and that's overlooked. So out of Mitsubishi came the Japanese Zero, and out of the Zero comes the unique markings which pertain to the military and also the very rigid thinking which was in World War II and through the zaibatsu. Now, I want to focus on land unit markings. They also, a lot of these markings are common to the carrier ones, but the carriers are a different theology completely to what I'm talking about tonight. I do know about carrier ones, but I don't want to talk about them tonight because they're a separate area of expertise. And one other thing to make clear about the Japanese markings, the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy had utterly different systems of markings. They had utterly different systems of aircraft. The Japanese Army liaised with the French in the 20s, and out of that they designed their own aircraft, such as the Oscar and so on and so forth. There was no commonality of usage between the two services, with 1 or 2 exceptions, one of them being the Ki-46 Dyna, which was used by the Navy and the Army. But just to underline, there's a completely different theology here, so we'll push aside the Japanese Army and focus on the Royal Imperial Navy. Okay, so where do these markings come from? They stem out of the Navy operational doctrine, which came between the wars. The Japanese Navy prided itself in being cosmopolitan and showing itself off to the world as being a cosmopolitan service. And that is why you will see unit prefixes using Roman numerals, the same numerals and letters we use in our alphabet. They wanted to show off their worldly credentials to the world, and they viewed themselves as a cut above the army. There was a saying in Japan pre-World War II, which was, if you want to see China, join the army. If you want to see the world, join the Navy. Coming back to Navy doctrine and training, this is a sophisticated bunch of people. Let no one fool you otherwise. As a child of the 60s, I was taught otherwise. And it's curious, the Naval Academy at Edajima, it had compulsory training for officers in many things, including foreign languages. You had a choice of 2. You had to learn either English or German. The point being that the Roman alphabet was ingrained within the Imperial Japanese Navy psyche. It did not touch the army. So, what's important to the Imperial Japanese Navy? 3 things are important. Rank, rank, and rank, or prestige, prestige, and prestige. Everything revolves around rank and structure. And the Navy drummed this into its officer cadre. By the way, the Japanese Navy was pretty well raised by the British Navy in the 20s. If you look at their uniforms, including that of pilots, it's almost a carbon copy of the Royal Navy, right down to the orders they issued, which are very Nelsonian. It's a separate subject. So the most important thing for Navy fighter structures was that the commanding aircraft, whoever was flying it, could be easily recognized in the air. So a series of airborne systems was preferred. So the interpretation, structure, and application of unit markings was decided in the field, but it was issued by Tokyo headquarters. So in other words, there was a large amount of discretion on a commander as to how he could decorate his aircraft, provided it fell within certain rule structures and was observed across the board. Unit colours. The Japanese Navy was big into colours, their favourites being black, yellow, red, blue, and everything followed from that. So the unit colours were decided at what I call Chutai level. A Chutai is sort of equivalent to a squadron, but not really. And each squadron leader usually took a colour with them. So in other words, if a Chutai commander was transferred between units, if he could, he would take his colour with him. So if there was a conflict of colours, such as one commander's got yellow, he's assigned to another unit, he wants to take yellow with him, if there's already another yellow there, then the more senior out of those officers would get first say as to which colour he could then apply to his squadron. And by seniority, if I've got Mr. Smith over here and I'm Mr. C and I've graduated one day before Mr. Smith, I am the senior officer. And this structure was rigidly observed. Never found an exception to it. The Tainan Naval Air Group is the classic air group of complex colours because they changed their structure when they left Tainan and they came to New Guinea. And there was a lot of complexity there. There was an officer called Kawai Shiro. He was a lieutenant and his favourite colour was black, but he could not transfer it over, so he had to change to yellow. And that caused office politics at the time. It's quite an interesting human dynamic. The two naval air groups which operated the 0 first were the 12th in China, and then shortly after the creation of the 3rd. And these two units were very instrumental in creating land-based markings, which I'll come to in a minute, and by and large those markings were followed as we went along. Now, the next curiosity with markings is that they changed again in design according to their parent unit. So, for example, most of the fighter units fell under what we call Koku Sentai. So that was the next highest unit. So if your fighter unit was assigned to that Koku Sentai, that dictated pretty well the fuselage marking on the aircraft, whether it was vertical, whether it was slanted, whether it was a chevron, and so on and so forth, and even what color it was. The next complexity we come to with all these markings is, I said before, you might recall they had strict systems. The problem here is that from 1942 to 45, those systems changed 4 times under Tokyo's orders. And the reason was that in the initial stages of the war, the Japanese had quick victories. They called it victory disease, and they were very happy to publish worldwide the glorious victories that they'd attained in air power, and they were very happy to have their units named accordingly. So the Tainan Naval Air Group was worldwide known at the time. It was publicised in Japanese newspapers and journals and so on and so forth. When the Japanese started losing the war, they restructured their units so as to try and obfuscate which units were operating where and so on and so forth. So in November 1942, there was the biggest restructure where all the named groups, such as Kanoya Naval Air Group or Tainan Naval Air Group, they were all renumbered. And a common error is, for example, Tainan Naval Air Group became 251 Air Group. Or historians write as 251st. It's not the case. I'll explain where 251 comes from, and this all comes into markings and structures, which I'm about to talk about. So 2 indicated it was a fighter unit. 5 indicated it was from the Kanoya or Sasebo area, and the 1 indicated it was the first unit from that area. So every unit number actually has got behind it a secret code. So if you look, for example, at number 751 Naval Air Group, which was the largest air group operating out of Rabaul in 43, 7 is a land attack bomber, 5 again is Kanoya or Sasebo districts, and 1 is the first unit. So it's more correct to say number 751 rather than 751st. And then you get more obscure units like 121, 1 being a reconnaissance designation. Anyway, so there's another differentiation here to throw more complexity into this. The markings were assigned along administrative lines, and this is important to know because there's a difference between what we call Koku Sentai, which is an air flotilla assignment, as opposed to Kushubutai. Kushubutai means an operational group. So quite often you had different fighter units being allocated or reallocated within different operational groups. That's an operational structure. The operational structure did not predicate whatsoever anything to do with markings. It was purely administrative structures which predicated markings. This is a key difference to some allied units which revolved around operational markings, not administrative ones. Okay, let's see, I've got 7 pages here, I won't get through them all. we'll come to that in a minute, I think. Now, the Japanese Zero, which is the main fighter I want to focus on, I'll come to marking specifically in a minute, but I want to comment on the model numbers. We're very quick to allocate model numbers, whether it's, for example, it's Model 21, Model 32, Model 52, etc. But when you look at the pressures of combat in the field, especially around Rabaul, which I argue is the most active combat theatre for the Japanese in the entire war, there's a lot of pressure on the Japanese for spare parts. There's a lot of R&D going on behind the scenes. I've got copies of Admiral Kusaka Junichi's diary. He was the commander of the 11th Air Fleet, and he was very supportive of modifications in the field, and he was very supportive of weapons testing and modifications too. And this is rarely acknowledged in any histories that are written about it. It was quite extensive. So, for example, there's a lot of field hybrid modifications. They're not as extensive as the Allied ones were. For example, Kenny's Air Force, you know, you've got strafer modifications of A-20s and B-25s and so forth. But nonetheless, the modifications were there. And the most ubiquitous modifications were made to the Model 52s, Zeros, which started appearing in Rabaul as early as September 43. So they interchanged exhaust systems, aerial systems, and a whole bunch of stuff. So my point is, if you see what you think a Zero is, you identify as, say, Model 22 or 52, you might not be right, because they were changing wings, they were changing exhaust systems. You just don't know what you've got. And I think the best one I've seen was there was a Model 22 which had a Model 21 wing on one side and a Model 52 on the other, because they were shorter parts. And yes, I suspect it flew lopsided. Admiral Kusaka was very encouraging of weapons experimentation, and his favourite air group was 204 Naval Air Unit. They had their own weapons testing centre, they had their own reconnaissance and other minor aerial units. So there were a lot of weapons tested on the airframes, and the results of these tests went back to Mitsubishi factory, and the rest is history. Aerials, I'm sure a lot of you know, were removed in the field, especially on the Model 21s. They proved, radio communications proved useless, and the main reason was short-circuiting on the airframe, complexing transmissions through the ignition system. The Americans were very good at negating this. The Japanese engineers couldn't work out how to prevent it, and so most Model 21s have got their entire systems pulled out. Okay, we had we're talking now about, I'll talk about generic markings. On the 27th of August 1943, Tokyo, now the Japanese are losing the war, they want to become less conspicuous. So because of the quote-unquote possibility of being misidentified as enemy aircraft during combat, all fighters assigned to Southeast area operations were ordered to paint out the white outlines on the Hinamaru, on the red circles. Now, the white outline was ubiquitous and began to appear when Nakajima started making the Zero, and all Nakajima Zeros had the white outline. And later on in the field, the white outline was applied to the earlier Model Zeros as well. But this order came out in August 43 to get rid of them. The problem with any order, as you probably know, is sometimes there's a lag of several months before they take effect. For example, the red circles of the United States Army Air Corps on the Kitty Hawks were ordered to be painted out in May 43, but I've got photographs of them as late as May 42. I've got photos as late as January 43 where they're still in place. So the same with the Japanese. Because of the pressures of combat and administrative systems, quite often these orders took months and months to implement, or they were ignored, not because they were being recalcitrant, but simply because they're too busy fighting a war to worry about painting their airframes. When we come to markings, unit markings, specific unit markings, the other thing to remember about the Pacific Theatre is there was constant change of airframes between units. This was occurring all the time, mainly because of maintenance. secondarily because of maintenance, but firstly because some units were broken up and recalled and their entire inventory was redistributed amongst other units. So when you find a wreck in the jungle, and I've been to many Japanese Zeros in New Guinea jungle, you'll find remains normally of at least 2 units, if not 3, which are still hidden on the airframe. So that's another complexity. And some of these units were operating previous units' markings with their unit codes on the tail, if that makes sense. So there's no hard and fast rules on any of this because of the pressures of combat, which force a lot of things. Another myth I want to blow apart is you'll quite often hear, oh, this Zero was assigned to so-and-so. The favourite one I like is Nishizawa. This is Nishizawa Zero. Well, no, it's not Nishizawa Zero because at lower rank levels, in other words, less than officer, fighters were allocated on the day. You took what you were given on the blackboard, and that was it. So, alternatively, as I said, officers had to be identified in the air, or leaders' aircraft had to be identified in the air. So, if an officer wasn't flying that day, he could happily allocate his Zero to the rank which was leading the combat that day. It could have been a warrant officer, it could have been a flying pilot officer class 1, it could have been even lower. So there's no such thing as having your Zero assigned to you, with one exception, and that is that most naval air group commanders had their own private Zero, and that was flown exclusively by them when it wasn't being maintained. When it wasn't flown by them, they gave it to the next most senior officer to fly. So that's about the only serious allocation that there was. There's a famous photo of code U1-105, and in about every Western publication you see that it's labelled as Nishizawa Hiroshi is fighter. It's not. It's for many reasons I won't go into at the moment. Another key issue here is calligraphy. So what you will find is that even though the Imperial Japanese Navy had a standard set of calligraphy and how they should be painted, what you will find normally is in every unit there was a particular person who was assigned, or an artist who was good at doing the calligraphy, and there's a lot of subtle differences in the calligraphy. So you can tell immediately by looking at some of the letters, some of the numbers, as to which unit was operating that particular Zero. And the classic case is number 4 Naval Air Group, which wrote their 4s. I don't know who their calligrapher was, but the 4 was quite extended. And you'll find this numeral 4 appearing later on in Tainan Naval Air Group Zeros. And that's because when number 4 was disbanded, their entire inventory was reallocated to Tainan Naval Air Group, but then you've now got the pedigree of the aircraft. So we've been able to quite extensively identify all sorts of patterns and systems within this. There's 2 gentlemen in the United States who are serious world experts on this, and I've harnessed a lot of their knowledge in my books. Okay, victory markings. Everyone likes to buy models with victory markings. I think, as I can recall, I've only seen 2 photographic evidence of 2 Zeros with victory markings on them. One was a number 3 Naval Air Group Zero at Rebelle, and there's another one somewhere which memory escapes me. But the favourite model, the modeller's favourite is the Zero which has allegedly got 60 blossoms painted on the side. Now, I'll explain to you how myths like this arise. I've never seen a photograph of that Zero, and nor have you, I suggest. If you do, give me a copy, I'll pay you thousands for it, because I don't think it exists. The pilot concerned was Warrant Officer Iwamoto Tetsuzo, and the reason this story has arisen is in his memoirs, he wrote about painting the blossom victory markings on the side of his fuselage. The problem with that is that the photos never existed, and Iwamoto, as I said, didn't have his own Zero assigned because no pilot of that rank did. So however, the problem we've got with Iwamoto is he cites two tail numbers, both of which are valid, and he died from post-surgery complications in 1955. He was only aged 38, but he wrote his memoirs a good 10 years after the war, and those memoirs were drawn from notebooks which he kept after the war, not on diaries he kept during the war. So he claims that he painted these on his Zero. Maybe he did. As I keep saying, I haven't seen a photo of it. However, the main issue here is that individual notoriety was not widely accepted within units, certainly after 1942. Throughout 1942, a little bit of personal acceptance or credit was given for aerial victories. From 43 onwards, not really, because the Japanese were losing the war and they had their backs against the wall. And when you look at unit logs, by all means have a look at this later if you like. Japanese records, unit records are extensive. That's the crew list just from one particular mission on one day. And normally each entry for a particular mission is about 3 pages of data. That's just 1 page. So aerial victories were credited to the unit which fought at the time on the day, never individually, with a few exceptions. I'm now talking about 1943. In 42, they were individually credited, or could be. Okay, on the side of some fuselages, there's quite often a thing we call hokoku markings. And can I pick that up? I won't. In this case, that's an A5M Claude, and that's hokoku there. This means patriotism, and it's a number, 260. These were sequential numbers. They were normally painted on the Zero on the side of the airframe like this was. They're a donation. They indicated donation. So the hokoku appeared here, and underneath the name of the donor appeared. And quite often it was things like, for example, girls' schools, boys' schools, patriotic organisations, factories, sisterhood organisations, all got together, bought a Zero and painted it on the side of the fuselage. So for patriotic reasons, you'll recall I said that some commanders had a specific aircraft assigned to them for purposes of prestige and patriotism. If they could get a hokoku aircraft, they would. There's quite a few Japanese Zeros which had those markings on the side. All right, so how do they do this marking of indicating a flight leader? The answer is, I'll refer to the Tainan Naval Air Group because that's the quintessential definition of how they did this. So the Tainan Zeros had a slant on the side of the fuselage, not a vertical stripe, a slant. Now, the reason it was a slant was that the Tainan Naval Air Group was assigned to the 25th Air Flotilla, and all 25th Air Flotilla units had a slant assigned to it. So the Tainan Naval Air Group took it a step further and indicated the particular squadron or chutai by colour. So I might not be correct here with my memory, but for example, so first chutai I think was blue, second was red, and it went from there. So, however, if you had a commander's aircraft, it had 2 stripes, and that would indicate that that was an officer, an officer rank. Either a first lieutenant or a second lieutenant was flying that aircraft. The Tainan Naval Air Group took it to different lengths because then within the substructure of 3 aircraft, you had what they call a chutai, and they designate the chutai by stripes across the top of the fin, 1 on the top or 2. So the naval, the commander's aircraft had 2 slanted stripes and 2 horizontal stripes on the fin. And that's how the Tainan Naval Air Group label their aircraft. So you can look at any particular Zero in the Tainan Naval Air Group and you can tell which squadron it's assigned to, which sub-unit it's assigned to, its parent naval air flotilla and the rank of the person who's allegedly flying that aircraft. So that was very easy to do in midair. Now, as the units came down in 1943, each unit used a different system and adhered to it pretty strictly. Final thing for you guys as modelers is you've got to remember the climate of the South Seas, or New Guinea climate, is absolutely brutal on these airframes. It desaturates the paint structures. So there's no such thing as the correct colour of, what colour red was it? Well, how long has it been in the sun is my answer to that. But essentially the colour systems were desaturated and very strongly so. I think the best phrase I can use is it's ordered chaos. So you've got this strict hierarchy of markings, how they're meant to work, but how they work in reality given high airframe turnovers, transfers between units, the latency or otherwise of particular units to follow Tokyo's orders, it all feeds into the mix. So you wind up with a hodgepodge of markings. I think what I should do is probably stop there and take questions, because otherwise I'm going to talk all night. How many minutes have I gone for? Someone got a clock? 30? I've gone over time. Okay. So look, I apologise because I'm talking off the top of my head on a subject I know back to front, and I suspect all I've given a lot of you is a bunch of complexity, but not as much as Tokyo gave the units. So any questions? Sir?
So did this complexity, were the Japanese okay quite fitted? Did it frustrate them? And did it frustrate the Allies? Did that make
the Allies, Allied intelligence actually was pretty good with especially with the army markings, and the army markings that's a sort of a subject of art. That's a different thing. They're very good at. They had a intelligence series of documents called Telltales, in which they outlined captured aircraft, and they interpreted what they thought they meant. Now, with the Japanese Army interpretations, they pretty well got it right. They never got the Navy ones correct. They never understood them. And I think, to be fair to Allied intelligence, one of the main reasons for that was the constant change of airframes and markings. And like I said, there were 4 separate edicts from Tokyo on here's how you're going to mark your aircraft, and then they'd change it a few months later. So there was little or no consistency in the markings, whereas the Japanese Army, when they had a tail marking to signify a unit insignia on their tail, they normally kept it for most of the war. For example, 248 Sentai had the 2, 4, and 8 swallows on the tail, and they maintained that throughout the war. So that was consistency, but not with the Navy, for the reasons I've outlined. But yeah, that's a good question. Sir?
There's a couple of Army KR-61 models on the table there, modelling the same aircraft, and it has a number of kill markings on the side of the cockpit.
Yeah, yeah.
White aircraft silhouette.
Yeah.
Kill markings are more common in the Army.
Yes, they were, but they still weren't that common. And the most documented KI-61 out of the South Pacific Theatre was constructors number 247, I think it was. It was the one captured at Cape Gloucester. That was assigned to 68 Sentai. That actually belonged to the unit commander and had been abandoned because the cooling system had broken down. But the victory markings on that, I think there were 3 as I recall. But they're, again, yes, they were more common in the Army, but even then, not that common.
Could they also be assigned victories supplied by an aircraft rather than a pilot?
Yeah, what a good question. I'm not on firm ground here, because the marking was usually applied by the pilot himself, as opposed to Allied aircraft, where, as I'm sure you know, it was quite often crew chiefs who applied markings. I'm pretty sure it was applied by the pilot, but whether a secondary pilot added to that kill, honestly, I don't know. That's a good question, because there's so few examples of it, you see.
Yeah. Given what you know of the current
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm not a cross kits. I build stuff in 3D. I don't make these. Yeah.
Can I ask a question that's sort of slightly away from
Yeah.
this Steve, but a same general subject? What are your next offerings in the sort of South Pacific and Guadalcanal Air War series?
Oh, okay.
Like a lot of
Yeah.
people, I've been really enjoying those,
Mm.
and I'm just wondering what's
Right. So Volume 3 on Guadalcanal comes out 2 months' time, and we're going to continue with the South Pacific Air War series. We'll take it right through until the South Pacific Air War shuts down, which is pretty well August 44. After that, it's dead in the water. It's moved to the Philippines. We're going to continue the Guadalcanal series right through until February 44, which is when the air war shut down at Rabaul because Kusaka ordered evacuation of all Rabaul air units back to Truk, and they'd all left by the 28th of February 44. But it's going to take us years. There's so much in there. It's frustrating for us, my co-author and myself, Peter Ingman and I, because I go right into the Japanese records and we keep finding stuff that we had no idea existed. Good examples is the airdrops onto the Kokoda Trail and at Buna to the Japanese troops. And almost none of those are reported in Allied histories. And the reason is they were done at night by Nell bombers, G3M2s. So we keep finding stuff like that that we had no idea existed, you know. So yeah, and lots of X factors in there, like weather reconnaissance missions flown out of Rabaul. 204 Naval Air Group had a special reconnaissance weather air group detachment, and when Tainan Naval Air Group left Rabaul in November 42, they reassigned their reconnaissance aircraft to 204, and we're finding missions flown over Rabaul, over Guadalcanal, which appear in no Allied histories because they were flying at 30,000 feet. But some of the reconnaissance reports, they're extensive. You know, they're really quite something. Mm. Other questions?
What's the most interesting discovery you found?
I think the most eclectic thing to me is because I said I've been into several wrecks, Japanese wrecks of Zeros, and to put paid to the argument, quite often you'll see it discussed on forums, oh, did the land units remove their tailhooks? The answer is no. And if you think about it, the Zero is such a light airframe, the tailhook itself weighed about 70 pounds. It's at the extremity of centre of gravity. So if you find a Japanese Zero in the jungle, you will find the tailhook attached to it, whether it's land-based or carrier-based. But the most, I'll conclude with one fun fact. One of the most unusual markings was a Scottish tartan pattern on a Japanese carrier-based Zero, Model 21 from carrier Hio. And the surname of the pilot was Makino. And he painted Scottish tartan pattern on his aircraft during the voyage to Buin, which is Operation Eagle in April 43 when Yamamoto was shot down. The reason is that his surname Makino comes from Macintosh. So his great-grandfather was a washed-up Scottish sailor, and he took great pride in boasting to all his colleagues how he was really half a true Scotsman. And to prove it, and I've got a photo of his Zero, and I can tell you it's really beautifully painted. It's a modeller's dream, that one, if you get hold of it. So these sorts of human interest factors are what keep me engaged so heavily in this subject. I come across so much human interest like that, which is really relevant to me because as a kid of the 60s, we were taught everything wrong about who and what the Japanese were. Not forgetting that the Japanese Imperial Navy, and I keep saying this, their roots are deeply embedded in the Royal Navy. And we mustn't forget that in World War I, they were our mates, they were on our side. And in fact, one of their frigates escorted part of our Gallipoli contingency. We had an officer exchange program with the Japanese Imperial Navy right throughout the 20s. And that came to an end with Pearl Harbor. All right, no more questions? All right, well, thank you for listening to my eccentricities, and I hope I've added a little bit to your knowledge base. And thanks again for inviting me, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.